Okay, this is church history, and this is our last session. We're going to deal with expansion and contraction, 1900 to the present. So with that said, let us open in prayer. Again, Lord, we do thank you for the discipline of church history. We do thank you for just the whole attempt at chronicling the movement of the kingdom of God, and we do thank you for that, but just help us to learn from it in such a way that we would not make the same mistakes that many who have gone before us have. So with that in mind, we pray this and pursue it in the name of Jesus. So you should have an outline, and you do have your bibliography on the bottom. Erdman's Handbook to History of Christianity, Tim Dowley. My Brother's Keeper, Rod Cragg. By Their Blood, Christian Martyrs of the 20th Century, James and Marty Heffley. Follow the Leaders Through Church History, Eli Mercer. The Christian Left, Lucas Miley. Church History in Plain Language, Edition 4, Bruce Shelley, revised, R. Hatchett, and then Church History in Plain Language, 5th edition, revised, Marshall Shelley. As you look at your outline, this is where we intend to go tonight, and we want to first look at the big picture. And then I want to spend a considerable amount of effort on ideas have consequences, and these are some, not all, of the ideologies that presented themselves in the 20th and the first part of the 21st century. And then we want to just look at a few notable people that I have selected to represent certain aspects of the Christian life. And then we'll just briefly touch on persecution, and then we will end with the overall application of the whole course. So from the outset then, let's look at the big picture. And one of the startling things about this is that the new centers of Christianity now are in what we call the Global South. And when we use this term Global South, we're talking about the area outside of Europe and the US. So generally this refers to like Latin America, Africa, Asia, India, and several other countries. And this is a notable consideration, considering some put the amount of believers in Europe at about 2.5%. And now we know that figures can be a little tricky, but that's kind of the ballpark figure. And when we look at the rest of the world, and here's some stats from Shelley's 5th edition, 1910, 50% of the Christians lived in Europe and North America. 2010, there was a slight majority of believers in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the projection then in 2025, which we're not too far away, is that 70% of all Christians will live in the Global South. That's a fairly sobering analysis, considering where we live. We don't live in the Global South. The 20th century was marked by incredible growth in the church. And again, Shelley says there's more conversions in the last 100 years than any other time. We see growth in China, the Middle East, etc., and again, the decline in our nation in Britain. So as we consider this, and as we begin to pursue this lecture, again, I'm using Christianity in a general sense, and I can't parse out everyone's belief and see what it necessarily lines up with, but we're just using in its overall sense. The next thing I want to consider, and this is where we're going to spend the bulk of our time, is that ideas have consequences. And we're not foreign to this concept. And that's why we preach and teach with vehemence what we do, because we realize that it does affect people. Whatsoever man sows, that's how he also reap. And all of us sitting here, with the exception of some children, have lived in the 20th century as well as now the 21st century. And we have seen the fruit of belief systems worked out. By far, and I say this unapologetically, being somewhat, I guess you'd say, an amateur historian, that the fruit of Christianity on the scale measuring with other ideologies far outweighs them in the benevolence done toward human society. In other words, the benefit of human society. And just medical missions in Africa is one area of consideration. Now, that's not in vogue to say that, because we are living in an era where any concept of colonialism is denigrated. And for those who are at least aggressive enough to do their homework, they realize that in British colonialism, there was many positives, and attached to that was the movement of the church. So when we see people who, again, attack the church, we do have to realize that, well, maybe you're not doing your homework, or, which is often the case with the Marxist diatribe, is they want to just eliminate the past and vilify anything that does not conscribe to their dialogue. So we want to be up on that, and we want to understand that. And why do I want to survey these ideologies? Because it's very helpful to know what's in the lake before you jump into it. And we are immersed in the culture, and we want to make sure that we at least are somewhat conversant with these ideas. And I know the overall teaching ministry here in this church and others does familiarize people with these ideologies, but I think it's important to consider them in the whole context of where we've come from as far as church history. And some of these ideologies have negative results and some positives. But I think you should just pay particular note to some of the negative ideologies, and I'll point them out. And the butcher's bill is just unfathomable. And when I say the butcher's bill, I'm talking about the millions, in many cases tens of millions of people that died as a result of these bogus ideologies. So in our apologetic, it's important that we are conversant with this, at least to some degree, where we can intelligently just plug people into the facts. And that is a challenge nowadays, because particularly in the woke culture, which we'll talk a little bit about, the empiricism is not in. The general dialogue is, well, I don't want to hear what you have to say, because this is what I feel. This is my mode of response. So, and I'm going to act on my emotive response. And again, we have to challenge that in a good way with factual evidence. So as we look at some of these, I'm just going to say that I will broad brush them. And some terms actually change meaning, and I may not be quite as accurate as some who want to pick the meat off the bones so intently, but we're just using it for our general purposes. So the first one on your list, and we saw this ideology in the 20th century, and it's alive and well right now in the 21st century. It hasn't, just because some of these countries have sort of downplayed it, it's alive and well. And this is communism, Marxism, et al. I've kind of lumped this all together. And this is the whole one-party government control of everything: economy, lifestyle, particularly suppression of religion, suppression of free thought, the so-called redistribution of wealth, which we know is a bogus claim as well, because most of the time it just produces champagne socialists. And that's a term that I've recently become familiar with coming out of Britain, that these, let's just say, upscale socialists who live pretty nicely, and the rest of the, let's just say, clientele is flattened in wages, et cetera. So we know that that whole redistribution scheme is bogus, but this ideology, like I said, is not dead. So it is being funneled into, in my opinion, the World Economic Forum and what they're attempting to do, this world communism. But as we think of the countries that particularly embrace this, like the USSR and China, the butcher's bill was tens of millions of people plus. And to this day, there's Christian persecutions in these countries. So that's definitely a negative ideology. and I will not unequivocally say, from what I read and understood it, I don't see any positives in it. There may be a few here and there, but I don't see any. The next one on your list, Nazism. And again, this is that totalitarian fascist class unity, and we saw this in the first part of last century into the middle of the century, for the most part, in Germany. And this ideology is control of private property, capitalist enterprise, but it served the state. And in the case of Germany, it was very racist. And we saw the consequent result was violently anti-Semitic. And unfortunately, we're seeing that resurrect again today, anti-Semitism, particularly in the last month. But I found it interesting, what little bit I know about international news, that Germany is taking a pretty hard stand in at least on the surface, in the defense of Israel. So maybe they've wised up. I don't know. But nonetheless, another ideology, Islam, and this is greatly on the rise, as you well know. And because of multiculturalism, that has thoroughly permeated the whole West. And it's, yes, and we have to just deal with it, confront it, and live with an understanding of what's entailed in that whole religious enterprise. Another one, fundamentalism, and this is a positive one, and this actually started as a reaction to the liberal movement in the early part of the 20th century. And there was a core set of 5 beliefs in this under this nomenclature. Number 1, the inerrant Bible. Number 2, substitutionary death of Christ. Number 3, the virgin birth. Number 4, the deity of Christ. And then number 4, the physical resurrection of Jesus Christ, and then the physical second coming of Jesus Christ. So again, this was a standard set of beliefs which went pretty much across a lot of denominations, and Machen is linked with this, and we're going to talk about him eventually, just briefly. But this term then eventually came to be used of more, let's just say, conservative Baptists and Bible believers in the latter part of last century, even into the present, as your fundamentalists. And I think a lot of times it's appropriated to those who may be in the dispensational tradition, but again, not unequivocally. And some use it as a derogatory term. And myself, I don't like that when it's used as a derogatory term, because in many respects, that's my background long past, 40 plus years ago. Another term that is worth discussing is this whole concept of evangelicalism. And here is a term that I'm going to just attempt to parse it out in the 20th century and the early part of the 21st century. But as far as I'm concerned, it's changed meaning. This is a term, like I said, that it has different nuances now, and we really have to be careful. But in its inception, it was just a definition of those, let's just say, Christians who believed in the authority of Scripture, Orthodox Christian doctrine, the born-again experience. And although a lot of those folks in the premillennial dispensational group fit under this category, there were others that would have assembled under this category, many of the Pentecostals and that sort of thing. But as we think of this terminology, the reason I brought it up, because we want to be careful about mistakenly and categorically saying that this movement had little or no cultural engagement. And that's not really true. And the reason I say this, because there was many attempts of cultural engagement in this group. Moral Majority under Jerry Falwell, James Dobson focused on the family Research Council, Christian Coalition, many church ministries, and we're going to talk about the whole megachurch ministry in a minute, but that had some noble intentions in engaging culture. So many of these aspects or these institutions promoted Christian school, they promoted Christian institutions. So I think that you've got to be very carefully about just broad brushing these movements, even though they may not have had a particular eschatology. And again, this is what I've come from. So I'm somewhat aware of that, but you have to ask yourself the question, well, why then wasn't there, let's just say, more cultural change pointing to a biblical worldview? And I think one of the main reasons is the whole pluralism. In other words, just on the market, that all views are cafeteria style. So as people in the culture maybe were confronted with a lot of these viewpoints, they said, put it on the cafeteria table and say, well, I can pick or choose whatever my inclination is. And as we'll see in a minute, we're going to talk about Billy Graham just briefly, but I think he sort of represents in a lot of ways evangelicalism in its heyday in last century, and maybe even at the beginning of the early century. Okay, now you're on point F in your outline, and here's one that is very elusive to try to define, this whole wokeism, the whole woke culture. And it's slippery as an eel. And I'll do my best, and I'll give it a shot. But originally, it was the idea of an awareness to social injustices and racism. But my, as it multiplied. So under this narrative is the victim and the oppressor mantra. Under this narrative is the systemic race. Under this narrative is the LGBTQ, etc. Under this narrative, and in the whole umbrella over it is the multiculturalism. But and what's interesting about multiculturalism, if you know anything about it, they're tolerant to everybody that agrees with them. But if you do not agree with them, then the tolerance level is in the dumps, and the intolerance level is mercurial. Politically correct is a watchword for this whole wokeism. And if you know anything about what politically correct means, that movement is old as the hills and twice as dusty. Some people think, well, that's sort of a new. No, it's not. Other fascist systems have used it. Communists use it. Nazis use it. And basically, the whole concept of the politically correctness is, well, we want you to think and act a certain way so that you don't think. And that's the way it is. You get in a box, and this is what you're supposed to think, because we don't want you looking outside the box. That's pretty much what it is. So under this wokeism, too, under this umbrella, you have BLM, you have Antifa, and all of these other groups. So that is a very important movement to understand, and I think most of you are pretty well educated in that, because that's what we have to deal with. That's the, let's just say, lay of the land as we present and not just teach biblical truth, but to attempt to live in it. So another one, as you see point G on your outline, is the megachurch movement. And I think there was some positives in this, and probably one of the big names of this was Rick Warren, and he's kind of been in the news as far as he's changed his standards on women in the ministry, that sort of thing. But generally the megachurch was user-friendly, religion was a personal choice, was based on market analysis to create an experience suited to the prospective audience. And like I said, there was pluses and negatives in it. But in the words of Shelley, and I found this very interesting, he says this, and I quote him, as a special version of allegory was embraced to extract techniques from the Bible which suddenly became a manual for success in life, unquote. So in other words, the biblical teaching was presented in such a way to sort of therapeutic moralism. And again, therapeutic moralism isn't necessarily bad, but if that's all you teach, like anything, if you just teach one aspect of theology, if all your whole theology is eschatology or evangelism or gifts or that sort of thing, then you have to reassess and say, no, I'm swimming in one stream. I got to swim in a broader stream, because the counsel of God is bigger than just one singular stream. So that's what marked that, and it was usually accompanied, and it still exists to this day, non-denominational, fast-paced, contemporary music, magnetic preachers, as Shelley says. But that has seemed to have plateaued to some degree. And out of that came the emergent church, which was the whole feeling-oriented church. No, propositional truth was out. And now that has seemed to have morphed into the progressive church. And again, in your outline there, if you want to read a good treatise on the progressive church, the Christian left, and I have that on there, number 5, the Christian left, Lucas Miley, his assessment of that's very good. And you may not agree with everything in the book, I don't necessarily, but he gives a very good assessment of what the progressive church is, very light on biblical authority, if any at all. The atonement is not the central, let's just say, pinpoint of the understanding of our faith, and very inclined to cultural adaptation to the point where some say this could very much be the state church. Take it or leave it. The next idealism on your outline there, Pentecostalism, and I'm going to use this in a broad sense, Pentecostalism linked with charismatic, and I'm certainly not an expert on this, but this one is quite important to understand because, as I'll show you in a minute, that in the global south there's a growing percentage of people that embrace this tradition. So in the old days, Pentecostalism was like from what I gathered, a 3-point thing. So you had conversion, you had sanctification, and then you had the baptism of the Spirit. It was like three. I guess you'd say works of grace, if you want to say that. That's probably not the best way to analyze it, but that's kind of changed a little bit. But there is a high emphasis on the baptism of the Spirit, and in some genres, they view Christ as Savior, Christ as the baptizer in the Spirit, Christ as the healer, Christ as the coming King, which aren't necessarily bad terminologies, as long as, in my opinion, if you classify them theologically right. But in this movement is, again, the full use of the gifts, healing, prophesying, etc. Now, historically speaking, at least in this country, we saw its resurgence from let's just say, small, smoldering embers in the first part of last century in what's called the Azusa revivals. And they were done in Los Angeles about 1906. About 1960 then is what we call the second wave. And this is where charismatic life infiltrated a lot of different denominations, even in the Catholic tradition. But now, the third wave, the 1980s, this is the Fuller Seminary wave. John Wimber, the Signs and Wonders movement, and the whole Vineyard Church came out of that. So the reason I emphasize this, because according to Shelley, the statistics, that in the global south, 1 in 4 Christians, and probably more, would be ascribing to this tradition in one form or another. So that's quite a substantial number. And as you just analyze the whole growth of the church, you realize that that's probably the main, let's just say, area, if you want to put it that way, that's growing. Now, I do follow some of the church growth in the Middle East, not the Middle East, but Middle Europe and Russia and Ukraine, that sort of thing. And from what I know, and I'm familiar with the ministry there, that Reformed traditions are making some headway there. And even in China, they're making some headway. I don't have stats for that, but we can't neglect that. So that brings us then to the last point there. And this is the whole idea of expansion. And we're just going to look at a few instances of this. Certainly not going to look at the whole picture. We don't have time for that. But for example, in China, about in the 1980s, it was estimated, again, according to Shelley, about 3 million or so believers, give or take. But supposedly in 2018, 100 million. So again, statistics is hard, and like I said, I would have thought in the 1980s there was more believers than that. Maybe there was, I don't know, but that would have been my suspicion. But that's the statistic that he gave, but the one that we now have in 2018, 100 million plus. Because the focus on the missions in the 1800s, 1900s was China, the old hardline missions, but we know in 1949 missionaries were expelled under Mao. Mao just figured Christianity would die a natural death. And I know you're familiar with his Red Revolution in the 60s, where that massive student uprising just pushed a complete cultural revolution. And this is my opinion. You're seeing that right now in the United States on our campuses. So I'll leave a sleeping dog lie. That paradigm of a very similar movement, nonetheless. But the government controlled the church. So the Protestant Three Self-Patriotic Movement, the registered church, but then there was house churches as well. But as time wore on and Mao died, another chairman came, Deng Xiaoping, I think I've said his name right, and he did, to some degree, relax some of the restrictions. But that didn't last too long. 2015, 2016, up again, they escalated, very severe restrictions, crosses removed from churches, limitations on worship, and especially persecution. And that's the present state under China at this point, as far as I see it. But the question you have to ask yourself, why was there this astronomical growth of the church in China from, like I said, in the 1980s, just in the millions, the lower millions, to 100 million in 2018? One analysis is because of the massive urbanization. And again, Shelley gives this statistic that 500 million people migrated from the rural areas to the cities. And that was actually a benefit, because in that migration, many people then were able to be confronted with the gospel. So it remains to be seen what's going to happen in China, but again, there's a big church there. There's no question about it. Korea, very similar, not to that degree, but 1960, 1 and 20 were Christian. 2010, 1 and 4 were Christian. Now, presently, the largest church in the world, the Yehoda Full Gospel Church, is in Korea, 800,000 members. Korea is the South Korea we're talking about here, not North Korea, but is the second largest missionary sending country in the world. U.S. is still the first, but South Korea is second. And I think it's the same thing. In Seoul, 5 million people went to 20 million very quickly because of the urbanization and the massive movement. So again, you see what we call the global south, even though some of these countries technically aren't in the global south, the massive growth of the church. I'll just touch on Africa a little bit. I had worked there myself in the early 1990s for a conventional mission. And even then, I saw the growth of indigenous churches. And when I say indigenous, I'm just using a term that defines churches that aren't necessarily linked with the West. So in some cases, these churches sprung up out of African soil, having been, let's just say, to some degree nurtured by missionaries. But again, the problems in many cases, I'm certainly not an expert on this, is doctrinal purity. But what I find interesting is that some of the denominational churches in our country, and I was just talking to a guy yesterday, he was talking about an Anglican church in the area he lived in, but they're under a diocese in Africa. I find that refreshing, because it's a very conservative Anglican church, but they are putting themselves under a conservative diocese in Africa. So you're actually seeing that tension. I find that quite interesting. Well, a quick look at South America as well. In 2010, we call this Latin America, and I'm referring to all of South America, you're seeing the largest number of renewalists in the whole world. And I'm using that term, the renewalists, that Pentecostal charismatic third wave. But it's a tidal wave in the churches in Latin America and the South. When you think of the Middle East, you see, there's growth, and some people say that the growth of the church in Iran is astronomical. I don't have statistics for that. In other places, but again, as we survey the growing movement of the church in the Global South, we realize that we are working in the paradigm of the shrinking of the church, and that certainly motivates us to be aggressive, doesn't it, as far as evangelism is concerned. Well, let's switch gears, and as always, we like to attach ourselves to some biographies, which I'm a big fan of. And I've chosen these to kind of represent certain aspects of what we want to talk about. Here's one, J. Gresham Machen, and we touched on him, I think, a couple years ago. But the reason I'm talking about him is he's a critical, let's just say, actor in the first part of the 20th century. So he taught at Princeton for 23 years. He stood against the liberalism of the time. He emphasized teaching the classical seminary, New Testament Greek, exegesis. There was great pressure to push more, let's just say, sociological teaching at Princeton. He eventually left Princeton. He fell afoul of the Presbyterian Church, and they actually booted him, if you want to use that term. And he started the Westminster Seminary and launched the Orthodox Presbyterian Church as well. Most notably, and he wrote various books, but most notably he's noted for Christianity and liberalism. Now, he wrote The Origin of Paul's Religion, The Virgin Birth, but he was a central factor in the early part of the century, and again, he was linked with these 5 fundamentals of the faith and defending the church against liberalism. And another one that we see in this time frame, 1898 to 1963, C.S. Lewis, and you know that name, apologist. He was converted at the age of 31 after a long, drawn-out intellectual battle, but he was a literary scholar, intellectual, very, very readable to the popular mind. Screwtape Letters, Chronicles of Narnia. And as you read and study him, you realize that some of his theology would not necessarily fit, at least in my norm. But by the same token, he was a major Christian apologist, probably the most famous in the middle part of the century, and most people to some degree or another are familiar with him. Well, another name, and we've talked about this one in the past, so I won't belabor it, is Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And you well know that he stood against the Nazis in World War II. And he was part of the Confessing Church, along with Martin Niemöller and others. And eventually he was executed by the Nazis, April 9th, 1945. And in some respects, his life, a very short life and execution, martyrdom if you want to call it, probably did a lot more for his influence had he lived on. I don't know. I don't say that callously, but the point is his Cost of Discipleship is a very formative book. So he is a quite notable figure. And another one now, and you know this name, Billy Graham, 1918 to 2018. I didn't realize that. He was 100 years old. Yeah, that's pretty impressive. So Billy Graham was a North Carolina farm boy. And he was converted under Mordecai Fowler, who was one of those good old-fashioned hellfire and brimstone preachers. I think we need some more of them. Yes, I'll leave that sit there. That was 1934. He went to BJU. I like quotes of people, and this is one of my favorite ones. And he left BJU to go to Florida Bible Institute. And Bob Jones said this to him, I guess it was Bob Jones Sr. there at BJU. At best, all you can amount to would be a poor country Baptist preacher if you live on, if you go out. Yeah, that's all you'll amount to, Billy. a poor country Baptist preacher somewhere out in the sticks. My, oh my. I've said a lot of stupid things in my life that I regret saying, and let's just say I've eaten crow many times. I think that's the idiom for that when the stupid things you say come back on you, but that one sort of gets a 5-star award. He attended Wheaton College. His evangelist career took off. He was working with Youth for Christ. And when they had that in 1949, the Greater Christ for Greater Los Angeles Crusade, it really took off then. And if you've read Unbroken, all right, I highly recommend you read that book. And even Franklin put out a movie on it. There was a movie put out, and that's good, but Franklin put out the rest of the story. That's where Louis Zamperini was converted under that, at that time frame. In his lifetime, he probably preached to 200 million people. And his emphasis was on the personal decision, which I'm a big fan of, that type of preaching, altar calls, which I'm a big fan of, sinner's prayer, which I'm a big fan of. And that was his emphasis. So there's no doubt, whether you agree with all his methodology or not, he had a big effect. And the interesting thing about him, there's really no scandal attached to his name. I think he seemed to have navigated his career and never any serious scandal. Well, another name, Corrie ten Boom, and you'll know this one, 1892 to 1983. And you know her, she lived in the Netherlands, and her father operated a watch shop, Casper ten Boom, and they were very strong Dutch Reformed. But they were very, very strong on honoring the nation of Israel. And she was involved in youth work in her life. She was single, but their family was very committed to aiding the Jews during the Nazi occupation. And her father has, as one of his famous quotes is, and I quote this, Casper, I pity the Germans, they have touched the apple of God's eye, unquote. They were involved in the Dutch resistance. Their house was what we call a safe house, and I'm told you can go visit that today. It's still there. And what this was it protected Jewish families, and they hid Jewish families and others in their house. They built a special room on the 3rd floor, and that's where the book The Hiding Place came from, as far as I understand it. She was arrested in 1984, February of 1984, and went to a couple different, let's just say, prison camps, and ultimately ended up in that hellhole, Ravensbrück. And even there, she ministered to the prisoners, and her sister had died in that camp. And she was eventually released because of a clerical error and God's providence. And some of you have read books about her, I have, but out of that then came a very just prominent, 60 countries I think she traveled in, and just a worldwide speaking ministry. And her message was, quote, pretty much Jesus can turn loss into glory, unquote. And I'll tell you what, that she put her money where her mouth is to proclaim that, because she lived through hell. And I remember reading one of her situations where she was speaking, I think it was in Germany, and a guy came up to her, and she recognized this guy as a former SS guy in a concentration camp. And she just was struggling, how on earth do I deal with this guy? Because he asked for her forgiveness. And she said, well, I just prayed to the Lord, you're going to have to give this to me because I don't have it. And she did. She accepted it and forgave this guy. And that's quite a testimony to her as far as just the reality of the spiritual experience. And well worth reading. Hiding Place, other autobiographies, even a movie out, The Hiding Place. Well, this last one, this guy's my hero, okay? Now, I won't have any more children. I'm 67 years old. But if I could convince one of my youngins, if they have another male, to name their child after this guy, Max Leidecke. Max Leidecke, Major Max Leidecke. And this account is found in My Brother's Keeper, that's 2 on your bibliography. I highly recommend you reading that. Rod Cragg, My Brother's Keeper. That's just a short compendium of many of the accounts in Vad Yashim's record of those who saved Jews during World War II. They're not all Christians in that book. Most of them are. But Max Leideke, 48 years old guy in the German army, Wehrmacht, I'll use that term, the German army, World War II veteran. He commanded a garrison in Przemysl, Poland during World War II. Lutheran, devout Lutheran, the preacher's son, wanted to study theology, but World War I broke out and he was absorbed into the war and he couldn't do it. So he got out of the war, survived the war. And then he was a journalist, all right? And he was let's just say no fan of the Nazi Party. And he critiqued them in the early 1930s, and he fell afoul of the whole movement and had very much difficulty even surviving. Once World War II started, he was reinducted back into the Wehrmacht. He served in Greece for a while, and then he was eventually transferred into Poland after Poland was invaded. But Leideke, among others there, they found themselves in a very difficult situation, particularly Christians, said, no, we don't have any animosity toward the Jews, but we're in these positions as German military officers. And there was others that felt the same way. And their persuasion was, we hope to keep these Jewish people in the ghetto there, that's where they assembled 18,000 or so plus, working in the armament factories, garment factories, etc., to try to protect them. But he got word from one of his sergeants, Oberlieutenant Battle, found out that the SS was coming to start to deport these Jews out of the ghetto. And he knew, and Leideke knew what that meant. That's death camp, etc. So they were trying to figure out, well, how can we stop this? The amount of courage of this guy and some of the others involved, he said, okay, to Battle, he said, you set up on the bridge coming into the ghetto over the San River in Poland there, and you set your machine guns and everything up. Imagine this now. So the SS came, and this guy's name isn't given, but the commanding officer there, Sergeant Major, said, you can't enter. This city is under martial law. I'm under orders. If you enter, I'll shoot. Can you imagine the fire there that these people were actually defying the SS? These are German Wehrmacht. These are German soldiers, okay, standing against them under orders. Well, that didn't go over too good. The SS did back off, and they appealed right to the top to Himmler, and Himmler made it very clear that any German officer that makes any attempt to protect the Jews, I will deal very ruthlessly with. And that's what happened. The next day the SS came, they deported 14,000 Jews. The general in the situation who tried to work with Leideke on this, von Giernoth, he was just forced into retirement. Battle was discharged. He was a middle-aged lawyer, but Leideke, because it was his scheme, he bore the brunt of it. So he was sent off to the Eastern Front, and you know what that was? That was almost certain death, and he was eventually captured, and he died in a Soviet concentration camp. So I found that quite impressive, because here's a Christian man that's caught in the mix, and boy, did he make a stand. And he paid for it, and like I said, he's one of my heroes. That moves us then to the next thing I want to consider before we get into some applications, and this is just martyrs and persecution. And we won't talk too much about this because there's so much that we have so many resources in the West now to familiarize ourselves with this. But with the hideous ideologies of communism, you know that multitudinous amounts of Christians suffered and died, and other as well as under other oppressive religious ideologies, even to this day. There's many suffering and even many martyrs. So this isn't a thing of the past. But there's one group of martyrs, and I've just chosen them because they were kind of inspirational in the beginning or the middle of the last century. And these were the 5 American missionaries that were killed in Ecuador in 1956. So this is Jim Elliot, husband of Elizabeth Elliot, you know that name, graduate of Wheaton College. Peter Fleming from Seattle, married 3 children. Ed McCully, married 8-month-old baby. Roger Udarian, wife of Barbara, had been working with the headhunting Javaros even before these other guys came down into Ecuador to try to approach the Aucas. And then Nate Saint, and yeah, you know that name, married 3 children, a pilot with MAF. So they all knew the risk, and they were attempting to enter this headhunting tribe, the Aucas. And they all knew the risk, and Jim Elliot has said, quote, "If that's the way God wants it to be, I'm ready to die for the salvation of the Aucas," end quote. And even a casual survey of missions and martyrdom, many times that was the mindset. And you see that particularly in Papua, and I'll make an allusion to that in a couple seconds here, that when these guys, and women for that matter, went into these headhunting tribes, they said, well, this is going to cost us. And I've often made allusion to that, to Western missions up from Scotland onto the west coast of Africa, and, you know, packing your belongings in a coffin. You know, when I went to Africa, we had ours in a shipping container. I didn't send a coffin along. But that was their mindset. No, we're going to, we know that these beachheads are costly. So just by way of side note, that's why I have literal tolerance for missionary bashing of the past. We have to be very careful about that. It's kind of similar to the whole movement of just whitewashing, particularly British colonialism, and saying it was all bad, when there's lots of testimonies that say, yeah, there was some bad things about it, but there was many, many positives. And at the outset of this course, I made allusion to Vishal Mangalwaldi, who has written books on that, an Indian apologist to the benefit of colonial India. But back to the story. So they wanted to reach this Auca tribe, and what's interesting, that Nate Saint would fly his plane around, drop some gifts in. So they eventually said, okay, we're gonna go in and we're gonna camp on the Kure River, and we're gonna set up a beachhead there, and that's what they did. And it was initially a friendly contact, but it turned sour. January 9th, 1956, they were all killed. And the reason they were killed, as a lot of these people got saved, even some of the murderers, was they were afraid that they were cannibals and they were going to come and eat them. So, you know, you really can't blame them for that. But in God's providence, he left it happen. Rachel Saint stayed, Elizabeth Elliot stayed for a while, and a harvest came. But out of this was like a very inspirational event in the middle part of the century, because many people really then committed themselves to world evangelism. And the Aucas, like I said, a lot of them got converted, and even their first martyr, a guy by the name of Tona, T-O-N-A, was one of the original killers. And he himself was eventually martyred in an evangelistic outreach. So you see this in other aspects of missionary endeavor, and not just missionary endeavor, but the church in general. If you go over to Papua New Guinea, and I always struggle, you know, some of that stuff's been renamed, but that beachhead was very costly with martyred missionaries. But even in the movement, in the great movement in the Dani tribe, if you're familiar with that, and we actually supported a missionary, our church did for years, and he was one of the instrumental guys in the movement to the Dani tribe. But even one of the Danis was eventually martyred. Salanuk is his name, he's in heaven obviously. But here again, the outreach to these tribal groups, and then these tribal groups many times went out as evangelists, and they paid for it with their life as well. So when you follow the progression of the advancement of the gospel, you often see that the cost for opening up new mission fields is martyrdom. And in many cases, the prolongation of the Christian witness is accompanied by persecution and martyrdom. And we see that today, very much so. And again, it's not difficult to survey a lot of this stuff. So there were and still are many who are willing to pay the price. And I've often said this, that it's one of the offices of the church to be cultivating foreign missions. It's healthy for the local church. And sometimes I hear people say, well, it's much more efficient to let's just say send national or pay for national missionaries. It's good. It is efficient. However, discipleship is never cost effective, all right? And let me run that by you again. Discipleship is never cost effective in the sense that you don't always get the immediate bang for your buck, humanly speaking. But divinely speaking, then you'll see the fruit. So that leaves us with some applications and overall applications of the whole course. This is what I want to take the last 8 minutes or 10 minutes or so. So we stand on the shoulders of those who went before us, and we learn from their positives and negatives. The church does not exist in a vacuum. So we have a heritage before us. And by studying church history, we learn positives and negatives, and I hope that it keeps us somewhat balanced, particularly as we learn negatives of others, maybe some even in the tradition you may represent. We must defend the positives of the church and not cave to the cultural woke pressure that writes it off in defense of their own intention to erase history, except the way they want to play it out to support the Marxist narrative. You really got to get this, that the Marxist narrative is just wipe out history, okay? That's foundation 1 or 2, I don't know, destruction of the family is another. But they're very aggressive in just broad brushing history. And yeah, we look back on the Christian church and say, yeah, there are some positives, many positives, and some negatives. But we don't have a utopian view of things that it's a perfect world yet. But they have a bad habit of confronting us about our past, especially anthropologists like to do that. And, they like to just castigate missionaries as just being evil and self-centered. And I say, oh, yeah, so it's really self-centered, isn't it, to come in and teach that people, you really shouldn't kill the twin, or you really shouldn't burn the widow, SETI, etc. And I suppose some of these people, their mantras, well, don't confuse me with the facts. I'm going to believe what I want to believe. Theology matters, and we must be diligent to preserve its pursuit, especially in the context of the progressive church, all right? So theology does matter, and we have to aggressively pursue it, teach it, and live it. And again, in the confines of the Orthodox Church, I don't mean Orthodox in the sense of Russian Orthodox or Eastern, I just mean the confines of the church orthodoxy, conscribing to the 5 fundamentals, if you want to say it that way, and then some, that we have to make sure that we are theological preachers and teachers, namely because of the context of the progressive church, which is just drifting, aren't they? That's the picture in Hebrews 2, isn't it? Just be careful you don't drift. And that's a picture of a boat floating down the stream, just drifting away. Strive for balance in our beliefs and know when to bend and when to hold the line. There's no wobble room in the Arian controversy. There's just no wobble room. But unfortunately, in the Lord's Supper controversy in the Reformation era, there could have been some wobble room there between Luther in particular and Zwingli, but there was an inflexibility there that was not the best. So it's important to realize that. Encroaching materialism into the church is always a challenge. And we saw that right from the beginning through the Middle Ages, and even as we considered, let's just say, the reaction by the Roman Catholic tradition to that with monastics and all that stuff. But the answer is, stifling it by emphasizing service and giving. So if the church is saying, no, our goal is to serve, our goal is to give, to be a blessing. And that's where my dander gets up when people ignorantly or maybe purposefully have a bad habit of criticizing the Christian church down through the ages for our errors, because we are human. All have sinned and come short of the glory of God. I said, no, I don't think so. I'm not going to swim with you in that stream, because many of these people went out with just a service motive. I want to serve and I want to be a benefit to these cultures. And yeah, sometimes they didn't react to the culture the best way, but I think in many cases the intentions were noble, and that's what sets us apart. Didn't Jesus say, I've come to seek and save those that are lost? He was very big on servanthood, right? All you got to do is look at Philippians 2, 5 through 10. Despite eschatological positions, the church is to be applying the Word of God to all aspects of culture and life, okay? And I repeat that. Despite one's eschatological positions, that's a given, that we are to be teaching the Word of God and infiltrating our whole culture with no reservations, best we can do. And then promote an educated clergy, whether formal or informal. We've had the blessing, at least in the past couple centuries in this country, of having Christian institutions that you could go to and study and learn under the auspices of people who were very skilled in theology and languages. And that's a blessing. Not everybody can do that. I understand that. But I think we may be entering an era where these institutions won't be able to exist as such. But that doesn't eliminate the fact that it's very important for us to continue to push scholarship in the church and education in the church of those who are in ministry, so that they can minister to others intelligently. And again, that doesn't mean everybody runs off and goes to seminary, et cetera, et cetera. No, it's just a mindset that we need to keep developing and pursue. So that does end the church history course. And from the outset, my main emphasis was to encourage application. And overall, and I'm certainly not a scholar in that area, but I found probably the most helpful book on the whole thing is Church History in Plain Language. And it's now in its 5th edition. And I used the 4th and 5th edition for this lecture, but it's very readable and very helpful. And done by Bruce Shelley. He's long gone, but even the revised editions are helpful. Amen. Any questions? The church I mentioned is a full gospel church. Okay, so. But by the same token, I think and I'm not an expert on this, and I don't have a spreadsheet here, but I have got the impression that the Presbyterian church was pretty entrenched in Korea as well. But I don't know the answer to that. But the megachurch movement was big there, and I think still is big when you think about that. 800,000 members of that church, several campuses.
But what in the rural areas, same kind of thing, still pretty, Christian church still pretty influential when you get outside the major city?
That's a good question, because, and unfortunately, I left all my books at home, because Shelley in the 5th edition makes a comment, not about Korea, but in general, when he's discussing the megachurch, if my memory serves me correct, he did make the statement that most Christians still go to small churches. That's really the demographic, that even though some of these mega churches are gigantic, but the majority of believers go to churches, I forget the number, but they're quite small, so.
Just asking out of curiosity, why wasn't Catholicism?
In this lecture?
Yeah. Dumb question, but
No, that's actually a good question because Shelley talks quite a bit about it. I wanted to be selective in the sense of what I wanted to cover. And again, if you read church history in plain language, he does talk about some of the movement of the Catholic Church. And that's about the best I can do.
you wanting to be selective answers my question. That's fine.
I want to be selective only because I have a certain amount of time.
Sure.
And these lectures are very difficult to prepare for if you don't like have a stated book. I probably put 12 hours into one 50-minute lecture because there's so many things you have to, I got books all over the place, seminary notes, and I'm trying to pick and choose. But what's interesting, and I have a friend that's Catholic, in fact, I was talking to him last night. That's the chap I went to seminary with, and then he went back into Catholic Church. But we've been talking about this present Pope, and there's like a movement that he's trying to push, and I'm, again, not authority on this, but he's very selective. He's trying to push the church left. And there's many conservative Catholics, like my friend and probably some of my extended family members, who say, no, we don't want this.
Pretty high up there. Just got kicked out or bishop. Pope. I don't know what you say. Firing? Long story. He's not a bishop.
Well, and some of these bishops have really stood against the present administration on some of the issues, on abortion and other issues. They've stood their ground. So.
Just a comment about, when we think about persecution, and this is not to, take away from any of the martyrdom that's ongoing, but I think that one vein of reaction, I think, that kind of saw within certain churches during 2020 and events following is, you had people who full on just basically supported the state and said, Romans 13 says obey all the stuff. And then you had resisting churches, which were in the minority. And I would say that resistance is in the Reformed tradition. But there were certain parties, I think, that kind of, I'll call it a romantic view of persecution. That almost, we say the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. And so to that effect, there's almost a willingness for defeat to come so that we can experience persecution so that the church would be, seen as more legit or refining, or I'm not quite sure, but just don't resist, don't push back, don't speak out. That's a bad look. It's better to accept our martyrdom, or not necessarily martyrdom per se, but persecution. That persecution in America would be good for the church. And I disagree.
Well, that's why I'm a big proponent of everyone, every church, every person watching Andrew Brunson's series Prepare to Stand. And you know who Andrew Brunson was? He was imprisoned by the Turkish government for 2 years. Was it 2016, 17, something like that. And Donald Trump pretty much got him out. And you should read the book. He wrote a book. But Donald Trump pretty much it got to the point where his pressure on the Turkish government was so strong that their economy was going to collapse. But I'm saying this about Andrew Brunson's Prepare to Stand. You can get it. You can download it in. We went through it at home there. I read the book. But he has a very, very realistic view about persecution. He said it's difficult. It's tough. He's basically said there was no spiritual steroid for me. I just suffered horrendously, and mentally I suffered, and I got through it. But in his Prepare to Stand, he gives many tips. He says, here's how you can prepare for it.
But I think my point to follow, my thought to follow along with that is just that those who think that we should just take whatever comes and not speak up, not stand when we have the freedom to stand, if those men think that they're going to be, inspiring martyrs in the gulag, you have to stand today, and then when the persecution comes, you'll be the person who's going to be able to maybe lead the underground church in the woods.
Well, the law of the land for the gulag, and the gulag eats its own. And Dennis probably read Solzhenitsyn's book, The Gulag Archipelago, right? He's a Russian scholar, right? And that's what I found in that book unequivocally, that one day you're on top, the next day you're on the bottom. So my point, as far as I'm hearing what you say, is you might as well stand now, because if you think that compromising, you're going to cover yourself, and you're seeing that play out right in the American universities right now with this whole demonstration issue, in my opinion. So.
Yeah, so to add to what Andrew brought up, in your survey of church history, the idea that the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church, when people today say that, it's almost like they're giving an excuse to push back, to stand up, to resist in any way. But in your survey of church history, you think the people in the past that maybe were persecuted, that suffered, that died, you could say every single one of them said, "Oh, we're not going to resist. We're not going to do anything." Was that the sum total of their philosophy? We're just going to suffer. We're just that's it. No resistance.
No, I don't think so, because what little bit I know about it, and in that book I have there, it's on your bibliography, Marty Heffley and James, The Blood of the Christian Martyrs, that many times martyrdom comes as a contingency. It's not just because you were brought before a firing squad and said, resist Christ or die. But there was aspects that people stood up for things and they were martyred anyways. And again, my hero, Max Leideke, he didn't purposely, no, he just said, you're not going to do this. I'm standing with the Jews, and I'm a decent human being. I'm not just a Christian, but I'm a decent human being. But I've never been persecuted, so I have to be careful. The worst persecution I've ever suffered was maybe on a job. Somebody called me, rev or religious, or that's it. I never was at this point. If I live long enough, I will be, like the rest of us.
I just had a comment. It helped me going through this and hearing one of the things you mentioned, that they were not letting churches have crosses in them. And I used to not really understand that when I was looking at history. Like, that seems like kind of a small thing. Like, maybe it wasn't even a cross shape. Maybe it was just a T. Like, why couldn't you just put away your cross and keep doing the rest of what you were doing? But seeing these patterns through history, and what we're starting to see now is the problem was that the government was telling them how to do church, not that they were very attached to their cross declaration that they made. And so it helped me a lot to go through this and see that pattern, and better understand why they stand for things that sometimes don't seem like the most important things to stand for.
They could, I saw that in China. They were, if you probably following that in the news. they were forcing churches to close and taking the crosses down. Because that's a very powerful symbol, isn't it? It's not just something that people buy them at a jewelry store. Some people just buy it casually at a jewelry store and, oh, that's great, I wear a cross. But when you really think about it, it is an incredibly powerful symbol. And when it goes against their ideology, they understand that, particularly in China and other places, I suppose. You know. I always find it interesting that in these war cemeteries, especially like, well, even ours in Arlington, what do you see? Thousands of crosses. Now, I think in some cases, there's probably Stars of David there for some. Again, I'm not an expert on it, but every time I look at a picture of it, there's just rows and rows of crosses. And that's not a decorative ornament. And it obviously is painful to think that probably a lot of those people weren't believers, but nonetheless, there is that permeable representation of, I'm the resurrection and the life. He that believes in me, though he were dead, yet shall he live. And the cross is a symbol of that. That's it, right?